All right. So you've really piqued my curiosity with all of these articles and videos you've sent about people immigrating from Canada,
Hmm.
especially all the stuff focusing on the Chinese community's experiences.
Yeah.
And before we get lost in the weeds here, I think it's important to be upfront.
Yeah.
Our goal here isn't to put Canada on trial or slap some label on it.
Right.
We're just here to go through these sources together
Yeah.
and see what we can learn from, the realities that they're presenting. What's the
Yeah.
story?
And immigration is never simple, right? It's such a deeply personal choice, and it's always shaped by, your own individual circumstances, but also by global shifts and the specific situation of the country that someone has chosen to potentially move to.
Right.
And I think what's fascinating here is that these sources that you've provided give us an opportunity to look at both sides of that coin.
Okay.
So why people choose to leave and what's going on in Canada right now, socially and economically.
So let's dive right in then. One thing that really jumped out at me was just the raw data on emigration from Canada.
Hmm.
Um, what's the real story behind these numbers? Because 5.1% of immigrants who landed in Canada between 1982 and 2017 left within 5 years,
Okay.
and about 17.5% left within 20 years.
Oh.
Are those numbers high? Is that something to be concerned about?
I think those numbers paint a very broad picture.
Okay.
And I think it gets really interesting when you start to factor in the emigrant's country of origin,
Okay.
because the numbers change quite dramatically.
Now that you mention it, there was some analysis on, how that immigration rate differed based on where people were coming from. So,
Mhm.
why such a big difference?
Well, I think it likely boils down to what we call pre-existing living standards.
Okay.
So folks that come from developed countries like France, the US, or the UK,
Right.
they often already enjoy a very high quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, moving to Canada is often seen as a bonus, not necessarily a necessity.
That makes sense. So they're more free to move around if it doesn't work out perfectly for them.
Exactly.
But what about for those coming from developing nations then? Is it completely different?
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
For immigrants coming from developing countries,
Mm-hmm.
Canada represents a significant step up in terms of opportunity and living standards.
Hmm.
So they're less likely to leave, having already made that leap.
Right.
China is an interesting case because it falls somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Kind of reflects its unique position within the world, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Hmm.
Speaking of China, one of the sources we have actually featured the story of a Chinese student living in Halifax.
Right.
And it really put a human face on all of these statistics.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah,
I mean, human stories often reveal the nuances that data alone can't capture.
exactly.
Yeah.
So this young woman arrived in Halifax back in 2016.
Okay.
And she described it as affordable, charming. The people were friendly.
Mm-hmm.
But then she went back home for a year.
Yeah.
And when she returned in 2020, it was like a different city.
Wow.
Rents had doubled.
Oh.
Housing prices were through the roof.
Yeah.
The cost of living in general had just skyrocketed.
It's tough.
Yeah.
Especially for someone just starting out, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's like her experience in Halifax actually mirrors a much larger trend.
That's right.
Housing prices there have jumped by something like 80% in just a few years.
It's incredible.
Imagine trying to put down roots in that kind of market.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easy to talk about rising housing costs as this abstract thing.
Yeah.
But you hear about, a young person who's had to put her, entrepreneurial dreams on hold because rent has gone up so much.
Of course.
It kind of hits home, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's a good place to remind people that when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about families making life-altering decisions.
Absolutely. And I think her story underscores how crucial expectations are.
Mhm.
Because, if you come to Canada expecting instant wealth or success,
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
that's often setting yourself up for disappointment.
Yeah,
Growth here tends to be much slower and steadier.
right.
If you're looking for rapid advancement, maybe a place like the U.S. might be a better fit.
Mm-hmm.
For better or worse, things move much faster there.
Right.
But each path has its own challenges, of course.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It actually makes me think about those satellite families that were mentioned in one of the sources.
Right.
Where one parent will come to Canada with their kids for education and the other parent stays behind.
Yeah.
And the idea is to reunite later on, but that's got to be tough to live like that for years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And it speaks to a broader point, I think, about immigration, which is that it's rarely a simple one-way ticket.
Yeah.
There are often unforeseen circumstances and difficult decisions that need to be made along the way.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that data only reveals so much.
That's right.
We have to consider these personal stories and journeys as well.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about why people choose to leave.
Yeah.
Because one of the sources had a whole list of reasons,
Okay.
and it wasn't all about money.
Right.
Things like family job opportunities, even like just the emotional toll of being away from loved ones.
It's true. The reasons for leaving are often multifaceted.
Yeah.
What were some of the specific reasons that stood out to you from that list?
Well, family ties were a big one.
Okay.
You know, children finishing their education, and then the parents realize, okay, it's time to get back to our own life.
Right.
You know, back to our support systems.
Hmm.
Others need to return home to care for aging parents.
Right.
And of course, you know, sometimes a better career opportunity just pops up elsewhere.
Of course.
It's not always about Canada being bad.
Yeah.
It's just that, you know, life happens.
Absolutely. Life doesn't stop just because you've emigrated.
Yeah.
People change, priorities shift.
Right.
And sometimes those shifts mean that people have to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that life is full of twists and turns.
Yeah.
And sometimes those twists and turns lead people back to where they started or maybe to a completely new destination.
Right.
But even with all of these, you know, diverse reasons for leaving, the sources you shared did highlight some common complaints about life in Canada today.
Right.
You know, we see the headlines all the time: housing, jobs, taxes, social issues. It can feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
I hear you. Those headlines can be a lot to process.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge those concerns and to really listen to what people are saying about their experiences.
Yeah.
But it's also important, I think, to avoid painting with too broad a brush.
Right.
Like, challenges exist for sure, but they don't necessarily mean that, you know, a society is crumbling.
It's about nuance. Right.
Exactly.
And digging deeper than the headlines.
Exactly.
But let's kind of unpack some of these issues, because housing costs seem to be a huge pain point.
Yeah.
Especially for newcomers.
Absolutely.
One of the articles even went so far as to say that Canada has a housing crisis.
Yeah, it's definitely become a point of national conversation.
Okay.
And, you know, housing in Canada, expensive, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But the situation is often more nuanced, I think, than a simple, like, crisis label.
Okay.
Like, you take that word bubble, for example. That gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
We're not seeing a Japan-style bubble here in Canada,
Okay.
where prices are completely detached from reality.
Right.
The demand is very real,
Yeah.
and it's fueled by a growing population.
Yeah. Okay.
And very significantly, immigration.
So in a way, it's a good problem to have. Like,
Yeah.
people want to live here. So
Well.
that drives up demand, which then pushes up prices.
Precisely.
Okay.
And I think it speaks to the success, I think, of Canada's immigration policies in attracting people.
Right.
But it also exposes the need, I think, for better urban planning, more efficient approval processes for new housing.
Right.
Basically, a system that can kind of keep pace with that demand.
So it's more a case of growing pains than like a full-blown crisis?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what about jobs?
Mm-hmm.
Is the Canadian job market as welcoming as its immigration policies?
Well, the Canadian job market is generally quite stable,
Okay.
but it's also very competitive.
Okay.
And I think this is where Canada's conservative economic approach that you mentioned earlier comes into play.
Oh, right. One of the articles mentioned that, but it didn't really go into detail.
Okay.
What did they mean by conservative in that context?
Yeah, that's a good catch.
Yeah.
So in this case, it means that the Canadian economy tends to prioritize stability and existing industries over rapid growth.
Okay.
So think about natural resource extraction, for example.
Okay.
Yes, it's a huge part of the Canadian economy.
Right.
But there are also very strict environmental regulations in place that impact how quickly those resources can be extracted.
So it's less about move fast and break things and more about slow and steady wins the race.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that can be frustrating, I think, for people who come from faster-paced environments.
It's a completely different mindset.
It is.
You know, speaking of slow and steady,
Yeah.
one recurring theme in these sources was the frustration with bureaucracy in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, those long processing times, the feeling that things move at a snail's pace.
Yeah. And that's a valid frustration.
Yeah.
And it affects everyone, not just newcomers.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, I think this bureaucracy can actually worsen the housing shortage that we were just talking about.
Right.
Because those slow approval processes for new developments,
Yeah,
they directly limit the supply of housing,
right.
which of course puts upward pressure on prices.
It's amazing how these issues are all interconnected,
They are.
but are these issues being addressed?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The good news is these are systemic issues.
You
Think
think?
they're not insurmountable problems.
Okay.
With upcoming elections and a shifting political climate,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely potential for change.
Hmm.
But how these issues play out in the political arena,
Yeah.
whether the concerns of both Canadians and the newcomers are heard and addressed,
Yeah.
that's something that we're going to have to watch very closely.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see what solutions kind of emerge from this.
Yep.
But it's also important to remember that Canada doesn't exist in a vacuum, right?
That's right.
There's a whole world out there
Exactly.
going through its own upheavals.
Yeah, focusing solely on one country's challenges
Mm-hmm.
can really create, I think, a skewed perspective.
Mm-hmm.
We need that global context to make sense of things.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
right now, we're seeing political polarization in the U.S., economic instability in Europe, social unrest in parts of Asia.
It's true.
It's a stark reminder that no country is immune to problems.
And that's a crucial point to keep in mind, I think, when we're thinking about immigration.
Yeah.
It's not about finding a utopia because, frankly, those don't exist.
Right.
It's about, really identifying what your personal priorities are.
So how do we cut through the noise then?
Yeah.
And figure out what really matters when it comes to, choosing where to live.
Well, one of your sources, I think, hit the nail on the head
Okay.
when they said it all boils down to your individual values and your priorities.
Okay.
What matters most to you?
Right.
Is it a sense of security?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, abundant job opportunities?
Mm-hmm.
A particular lifestyle?
Right.
There's no right answer
Yeah.
in a universal sense,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a right answer for you.
It's like trying to find, the perfect anything, the perfect city, the perfect job, even the perfect cup of coffee.
Right.
We all have different tastes, different priorities.
Absolutely.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer. It's
Yeah.
about finding what truly aligns with your values, with your goals.
Exactly. And that requires real honesty with yourself
Yeah.
about, what are you actually willing to compromise on?
Mm-hmm.
And what are your non-negotiables?
Right.
Because immigration isn't just about finding a place, it's about finding the place
Right.
where your strengths and your values as an individual best align with the opportunities and the challenges that exist in that specific context.
Yeah, it's about finding your own version of fitting in, right?
I like that.
Not trying to conform to some idealized image, but figuring out where you as an individual can thrive.
Yeah. I love that, finding your own version of fitting in,
Yeah.
because it really highlights, I think, that immigration is an active process.
Okay.
It's not a passive one.
Mhm.
You're not just choosing a place on a map.
Right.
You're choosing how you want to engage with that place,
Right.
how you want to contribute your skills and your experiences.
That's such a powerful way to think about it. It's
Mhm.
not just about what a country can offer you.
Mhm.
It's about what you bring to the table.
Precisely. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important, I think, to gather information from multiple sources,
Right.
to talk to people who have lived experience in those places that you're considering.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's those conversations, I think, that reveal the subtle but crucial details that statistics alone just might miss.
So after all of this, after this deep dive into the realities of immigration from Canada, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with today?
I hope they walk away with a sense of empowered perspective.
Okay.
Don't let yourself be swayed by glossy brochures or sensationalized headlines.
Right.
Look at the data, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but also listen to the human stories.
Yeah.
And most importantly, reflect on what truly matters to you.
Okay.
Because immigration is a big decision,
It is.
maybe one of the biggest you'll ever make, so make it a conscious one.
That is some truly insightful advice.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
I feel like we've not only explored Canada, but also this whole concept of immigration in a whole new light.
These are the kinds of conversations I think that need to happen more often.
Yeah,
Open, honest, and full of nuanced perspectives.
I completely agree. Well, thank you again for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.